Good morning. Good to see you this morning. We're continuing our series about how God grows our faith big. And we've talked about practical teaching. We've talked about providential relationships. Last week we talked about private disciplines. And today we're looking at how God uses personal ministry to grow our faith. And I was thinking about this summer, our family took a trip to Yellowstone National Park. Anybody been in the Yellowstone National Park, been out there? Beautiful place. If you haven't been there, highly recommend it. We flew from Baltimore to Denver, got in a car, and we drove into the Rocky Mountains. And then we stayed in the Rocky Mountains for a couple days. We got in a car, and we drove from the Rocky Mountains to Jackson, Wyoming, which is about a 10-hour trip. And then we got the next morning, got in the car again, and we drove to Grand Tetons. And then after the end of that day, we got in the car again, and we drove 2 more hours into Yellowstone National Park to where we were going to stay. So we had spent a lot of time in the car as a family time. So we get to Yellowstone National Park, and we're staying at the Canyon Lodge, and we go to bed that night. We get our place that night, we go to bed, and I am still on East Coast time the next morning. And so I get up early, I go grab a cup of coffee, and I go to the visitor center. And I'm there, I'm like waiting for the visitor center to open, like the people outside of Target, with their cups of coffee, waiting for the doors to open. I'm the only one there, nobody else around. I'm waiting for the rangers to get there, and finally they get there, because I am wanting to go in and talk to a park ranger. I want to find out the secret places, the hidden gems of Yellowstone. I want to know where I can go have an adventure in the park and see wildlife and see things that most people don't see. And so I'm wanting to get the intel. So they open up, and I've been waiting and anticipating, and they come in, and the park ranger comes behind the desk finally, and I go up to him. I said, so where's a really good hike or a good place I could go to see wildlife, in their natural habitat? And he looks at me and he goes, well, just get in your car and drive around. I was like, I've just been doing that for 4 days. So I was a little frustrated, so I kept peppering him with questions like, well, there's got to be a place. He's like, well, really the best way to see things is to drive around in your car. Now this is true. It is true that you will see wildlife if you drive around Yellowstone National Park in your car. You will see plenty of wildlife. But I wanted to have an adventure. So I decided to do my own research. And I got the hiking books out, and I got the maps out, and I began to plan daily hikes each day we were in the park. Now, don't ask my teenage daughters about this, because they were like, oh, Dad, what are we going to do today? It wasn't excitement for them. It was, oh my gosh, what does Dad have planned for us today? But I will tell you that every day we had an adventure, and one day they're going to realize that later in life. But we had an adventure. Here's the thing. As each day we planned hikes, and they were hard. Sometimes they were very hard hikes, but we saw things that a lot of people who stayed in their cars or just went to the visitor center never saw. I can tell you about a time we were on a trail, and a herd of bighorn sheep walked alongside of the trail with us. And in fact, 2 bighorn sheep got on the trail with us and walked with us up the trail. You don't get that in a car. Another day, I was on a trail following a group of backpacking Boy Scouts, and we were in this valley, and there was a bison that came out of the woods, and our trails were converging, and I got closer and closer to the bison, and I had my camera out because I was going to get a really good shot, until I heard this voice behind me go, Matthew! And I thought it was my mother. And I realized it wasn't my mother, it was my wife, who never calls me Matthew. But the Matthew, and I said, oh, I got to stop. I'm getting too close. I'm behind you get camera crazy when you're out there. So, but again, not something you'd see a lot of bison in a car, but to see bison wild. We also saw a grizzly bear out in that same valley that day. Not too close. We didn't get that close. But we had experiences, and we had an adventure. And the thing about that is that sometimes it took a lot of work to get to the adventure. It took sweat, it took hard work, it took hiking, and there were times when they were complaining, what are we doing out here, Dad? And then we'd have an adventure. And they'd go, boy, this was worth it. It's the same way with ministry and personal ministry. And we're talking about personal ministry today, I'm not talking about being a pastor, I'm not talking about being a missionary, I'm talking about our ability to just minister to other people, to care about other people, to make a difference in other people's lives. We can all do that. And sometimes it's a lot of work, and sometimes it's a lot of sweat. But there are times when we will see things and we will see God in ways that we won't see God if we just stay in our car or stay at the visitor center. When we get out and get involved in a personal ministry to other people, that's where our faith grows big. That's where we see God work. Just like when I get to the top of that mountain and I look out at the view and I give thanks to God for what God has created. It's the same in ministry. When I get to that point in ministry where I see God at work in somebody's life, I go, thank you, God. It's the same thing. And that's why God calls us into ministry, all of us into ministry, and all of us, as we heard in the gospel lesson today, out of the boat. God calls all of us out of the boat, not just one of us. God called all 12 disciples, I think, out of the boat that day, but they didn't all get out. And what was keeping them in the boat? When we heard that passage this morning, what was it that was keeping the disciples? If you look on the back of your bulletins, you can look and see there's a repetition here in this passage of something Jesus said, of something the disciples were feeling. What was it that was keeping the disciples in the boat? Fear, right? Fear. They were afraid. That's what it says. They were afraid. Jesus actually says, don't be afraid. And so this is mentioned, I think, 3 times here in the lesson about talking about fear. And isn't that what keeps us from being in ministry to other people? Fear. We have different fears that plague us. We have fears that keep us in the boat. And there are fears that are sometimes valid, and there are fears that maybe just we're hiding behind because we're afraid, because we're uncomfortable. And really, when we get in personal ministry, it's pulling us out of our comfort zone and to say to us, give us the courage to overcome our fears and to be in ministry to other people. And it's not always comfortable. I can tell you that. It's not always comfortable. One of the fears I find that people have is that one of the big ones I think we have is we're afraid we won't have enough time. We fear that we won't have the time. And we look at our calendars and we look at all our schedules and we look at all our responsibilities, and I think those concerns and those responsibilities become overwhelming to us like wind and wave in the storm, right? They just overwhelm us and we can't possibly see past them. We can't see past the waves of our calendars. We can't see past the wind of all the responsibilities in our life, and we can't see where we could even make room in our lives to be in ministry to other people. And so that becomes a fear. We're afraid that we won't have time to be in ministry, to make a difference in somebody else's life because of our calendars, and I think they represent wind and wave to us. Have you ever gotten into a boat, any kind of boat, like a canoe or a rowboat or a paddle boat or a motorboat, or anybody ever get into a boat or out of a boat? Does it feel comfortable when you do that? No, it always feels awkward, doesn't it? It always feels uncomfortable. I want you to imagine that when Peter got out of the boat, it wasn't still waters there. So you know how hard it is and how awkward it is to get out of a boat, at the dock or on the edge of a shore, but he's in the middle of a lake and the wind's blowing, the waves are churning, and he's trying to get out. Think about how awkward that was for Peter. And I think anytime we start to make time for ministry in our lives, it feels awkward. It feels uncomfortable. It feels like I can't do it because I'm trying to fit it in. I'm trying to figure out how this is going to work. But as I get out of the boat, as I step over the rail and I start to do it, I start to realize that I'm getting out. I'm rearranging my schedule. I'm making time, and I start to find out that I can do it, what God is asking me to do. But not until I make the commitment to get out of the boat will I understand how it's going to work. If I just stay in the boat, I'll never figure it out. The other thing I think we're afraid of is that we're afraid that we don't have the ability or the skill to be in ministry. I don't have a seminary degree, or I don't know the Bible well enough, or I don't feel like I know enough to be in ministry to other people. I need to go take some classes. I need to do some conferences. I got to go talk to the pastor. I want to ask this question that's an obvious answer. Had Peter ever walked on water? No. He had never walked on water. He didn't go to a webinar on walking on water. He didn't go to a conference on walking on water. He didn't go to school to walk on water. He didn't know how to walk on water. The only thing he asked for was an invitation. Said, Jesus, if you invite me, I know I can do this. Because what was that about? That was about faith. This is a faith thing. He was saying, I trust you, Jesus. I know I can't walk on water, but I trust that if you ask me to come out to you, I trust that you can help me walk on water, even though I don't have the ability, even though I don't have the skill. We say often in the church, and there's often quoted, I hear quoted often, is that God doesn't call the equipped, God equips the called, the invited. It's the matter of that God, if I accept the invitation, God will give me everything I need to do what God is asking me to do. That's a faith issue. That's why our faith grows big when we do that. When we hear God's voice and we listen to God's voice and we act on God's voice, then our faith grows. And it grows big because we learn we can trust. And the other thing that we fear is actually what happened to Peter. We fear that we'll fail. We're afraid of failure. Or we don't actually say failure. We don't like to use the word failure. We don't like to think of ourselves as failure. So what we rephrase it as, I'm not sure I'll do a good job. That's what we say. I'm not confident I can do a good job at this. But really that's another way of saying I'm afraid I'll fail. Now, you and I look at Peter in this incident and we think that Peter failed. That Peter got out of the boat, and remember, he saw the wind. It says in the text that he saw the wind and the waves, and he took his eyes off of Jesus, and he began to sink. And so we look at Peter and say, see, Peter, you should have never got out of the boat. Which is a lot of times we think when we fail or have a mistake or that we shouldn't do it again. We avoid it then. Or we have a bad experience in ministry or something happens, and we think, see, I should have never gotten out of the boat. And that's the way we sometimes look at that passage. And we look at that passage and go, see, Peter should have never got out of the boat. He didn't know what he was doing. I would say to you that I have a new definition of failure based on this gospel lesson. And I don't believe that Peter was a failure. I believe that you're never a failure if you're trying. If you're giving your best, if you're trusting God, if you're getting out of the boat, and if you have to get out 100 times and fall down 100 times, you're not a failure. There were 11 other failures that day, and it wasn't Peter. Failure is not getting out of the boat. Failure is resignation. Failure is quitting. Failure is giving up. When we resign ourselves, when we give up, when we're not even willing to get out of the boat, we've already resigned ourselves to failure. If we try and get out of the boat, it's actually in that trying, it's in that attempting, it's in that at least being willing to put my trust and faith in God that I begin to grow in my faith and I actually learn. And if we're learning, we're not failing, is what I'm saying. If we're attempting, we're not failing. If we're trying, we're not failing. It's when we don't try that we fail. It's not the mistakes that make us failures, it's the resignation to the mistakes that make us failures. I thought about all that and I thought, how do you bring this all together? Because I think we're up against a lot of when it comes to getting out of the boat and getting into ministry and personal ministry. Because God wants to take us out of our comfort zones, the boat, and into ministry. And I think it's like this. We've got this boatload of fears, right? Boatload of concerns in us. And then we look at our calendars or our lives, and there's a lot of resistance to doing it. There's a lot of things standing in the way, a lot of obstacles, wind and wave, to getting out of the boat in our lives that want to make us say, stay in the boat. Don't get out of the boat. And everything within us and in our lives is telling us not to do it, except for one thing: God's voice. God's invitation. And God's voice, I always think about as just this nudging that just doesn't go away, that keeps nudging at us. And God's never a yell. I like to say that God is not one who yells at us. You know, God's not this demanding parent that yells and screams. It's a nudge. It's a prompt. It's something going on in our spirit that just doesn't go away, and and the reason we keep hearing it is because we keep trying to ignore it and not listen to it and make all the excuses for it. And here's the thing. How do we know if it's God? That's the question, right? Well, I came across this great quote from John Ortberg in a book that he wrote called, "If You Want to Walk on Water, You Got to Get Out of the Boat." He said this to help us understand: a career is something I do for myself. A calling is something I do for God. So to answer the question, how do I know it's God calling? How do I know it's God nudging? If it's devoid of yourself, it's probably God. If it's not about you, it could be God. If it's about helping somebody else, it's about doing something purely for somebody else, if it's about doing something for God, then it's probably God. If it's something for me or something that's going to benefit me, then maybe I ought to rethink it. I wanted to give you an example this morning of someone who listened to God's voice and someone who got out of their comfort zone. And this person her name's Ludmila, and she lives in the Czech Republic, and I'll let her tell you a little bit more about her story. But here's an example of someone who was in personal ministry to others. Don't you just want to go to her house? I hope not only do you want to go to her house, I hope you want to be Ludmila. That you want your home to be an embassy, that you want your life to represent Christ, that you and I, and that's the point, we're all called to be ambassadors. We're all invited to be instruments of God's love. None of us who claim to be followers of Christ are exempt from that invitation. God is inviting us. God is calling us out of the boat. Won't you join us? Amen.